Welcome to Essential Coaching Conversations with Kyle and Asim.
The real, relevant, and necessary coaching conversations to help you navigate coaching, teaching, learning, and life.
Welcome back. This is episode 5. Kyle, did you think we were going to make it this far to episode 5?
No, we were just pumped to get episode 1 out. So I thought
I felt
we
like
did it.
somebody was going to at some point ask us for some money to keep publishing this, but they keep letting us do it, so we're just going to keep going for it and seeing what happens.
Amen to that.
So we're now, getting to the point where we're going to dive into some things that coaches are using as and this is maybe my word for it or my thought about this, but sort of using it as a crutch to maybe write kids off or, overestimate maybe their ability to do something, or maybe overestimate their own coaching ability, or, a way to inspect kids instead of evaluating them. I think it shows like a tremendous lack of self-awareness for coaches who subscribe to this theory about body language, and that body language is this great separator between players who are equally talented or equally skilled. And for the most part, and I want to preface this entire episode by saying this, and Kyle, please, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're going to back me up on this. We are not saying that body language doesn't matter, right? And let that sit in the air for a second. Body language does matter. But we do not believe that body language matters as much as we think it does. And that there are layers to this, and that there is some nuance to this that we can, as coaches, sort of change our assessment of how important this actually is, and maybe come out on the other side better for it.
Yeah, I think that it's everything that when we talk about this or ask questions and go down these paths that seem to just kind of go forever, right? Like we haven't found the end of one of these paths yet, is not to say that something doesn't matter or that we're doing it wrong, but we like to look at all of these things through this good, better, best lens. And so saying that, like, okay, we want to work on our body language, that's good, right? Like, again, we're not saying that body language doesn't matter, but is there something maybe we could do to look at things in a little bit better light? And then when we get there, how do we level up, and what's sort of the best view of these things? So when we go on record, like you said, in terms of really any of these coach speaky platitude, sayings or soapboxes that we get on, what we're really trying to do is attack that point of view, not the person who's saying it, not attacking who's saying it, but attacking the point of view to say, is there a better way to view this? Is there a better way to raise our awareness as to what we're doing? And it's not so much what we're doing, it's the perception of our athletes and how they see it and what is sort of coming at them. So that platitude might speak something to you as the coach, but it really comes down to how it is being perceived and accepted by your athletes. And this is where we could get into that conversation of climate over culture. Culture's, again, when people think that we don't think that culture matters, which obviously it does, but culture being that, long-term view, your everyday habits, your character, whatever sort of definition you want to use for it. A lot of times our athletes don't have time for your culture to set in place. You just got the job somewhere and you've got 8 seniors. They don't have time for your culture 4 or 5 years down the road. Like that climate piece, what is happening right now in the now, their perception of things, your mission statement, your vision statement, whatever words you want to use. We're going to be committed, enthusiastic. We're going to be a family, whatever. Those are all great, good things to say, but it's better and best if our athletes are actually accepting that and their perception of that is aligned with your vision. And that's where we run into a lot of these roadblocks that tend to pop up. And body language just happens to be, an example that was extremely prevalent all summer in coach Twitter and coach speak about, going on recruiting visits, and college coaches are tweeting that, I'm not going to sign this kid because they had bad body language when they got pulled out of a game. And then we sort of take it to the next level, like, oh, well, this kid put his grocery cart back in at the grocery store and
Sign them right away.
picked up all the cups. So that's what's going to get him the scholarship. And like you said, yeah, there are, hairs to this that we could split. And again, it's not to say that body language does not matter, but can we get past that? Can we level up our understanding and our awareness to come out on the other side where we're looking at these things through a different lens and say, okay, yes, it matters, but if we're just constantly leaning on the platitudes and the tropes and the coach speak, are we really sort of telling on ourselves that we have a very limited understanding of how these things, again, not just are happening, but how they're being perceived by our athletes?
So then we even can take that to another level. And I don't know if this is where necessarily we'll go in this recording, and maybe it's a future thought, but this is also becomes then part of that equity and inclusion issue, that you and I both know that I'm very, very passionate about. And a lot of the work that I
All
do
right.
is understanding how to create those equitable environments, and really understanding the root of equity being getting people what they need when they need it. And so if we're operating from one decisive schema of, this is what body language is supposed to be like, this is how it operates in our program, this is what it is, you're really sort of missing the point, because that player perhaps that you're watching has lived with their parents or their guardians for 17 years, and certain things happen in their household that you have no idea. And so that's, in a manner of speaking, equivalent to you saying, well, I don't like how that kid was raised. I don't know what that kid's, what, my parents would never have allowed that. Therefore, that player cannot be part of our program. If you really look at that from a macro point of view, it's absolutely ridiculous to think that about anything else other than body language. Yet coaches do that all the time, right? We don't know the inner workings of people's homes. We don't know the inner workings of people's, communities that they live in. We also don't know, and this is something we'll get into later on, we also don't know that player's story, especially if this is in the recruiting process. Now, if these are kids on your team, you still likely don't know their entire story unless you've known them because they've grown up with you or they've been a part of your life since they were babies. At the end of the day, there are so many other things that contribute to what you may perceive as bad body language. And in order to really get to the root of it, we have to become a little bit more self-aware as coaches, and also about our own body language. And that's something we haven't touched. And we've been now recording for like 5-ish minutes. We haven't even touched that thought that we're going to get into today about coaches assessing their own body language, and really even their regular language. We may not even go there. I feel like I'm going to get, I'll get too heated and it's too late at night for all that. But assessing coaches' body language, and what we have some questions to ask, and obviously we have questions to ask, but just some thoughts that hopefully will, as Kyle said, get us to, from good to better to best in the span of the next 45 or so minutes.
So when we start these things, I think one of the best places to go is really at the root of all of it, right? And say, okay, if we're gonna talk about and assess body language, we really need to start thinking about how we're going to define what body language is. What is good body language? What is bad body language? And again, like using a little common sense here. Obviously, if kid gets fouled, or we take them out of a game, or they're sitting on the bench and they're like laying down on the bench with their phone in their hand and they're flinging towels and kicking water bottles. Like, yes, that's obviously something that needs to be addressed. But I feel like a lot of times the shade of gray here is like really, really, really slim.
Hmm.
And we just sort of assume that because the player is acting a certain way that they have quote unquote bad body language. When really it might be, they're just disappointed in the way things turned out. And I mean, we've seen this summer too, entire videos being produced on
Hmm.
Twitter with players whose seasons have come to an end and they're disappointed, they're sad.
Shout
But
out
yet
Alan Stein.
that's used to twist it into saying that these kids have bad body language and therefore you know, they're not winners, or they don't have high character, or whatever that, however you sort of want to define that as. But to use those examples to say this is bad body language when it's no, my season just came to an end. Like, what am I supposed to be happy? Because these same coaches, same inspectors, we're not even gonna call them evaluators. The same inspection process follows the same line of thinking of, well, if I miss a shot or if I get fouled or I get taken out, what should I just smile and like skip my way to the bench? Should I be happy that I screwed up a rotation on defense? Because then I'll get accused of not being serious enough,
Or not being competitive.
not being competitive. So where is this very, very, very fine, thin line? And again, I would struggle with this as a 37-year-old. What am I supposed to do as a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old, 20-year-old that is still sort of figuring out, life and everything that's going on in their heads, right? And a lot of times when these assessments are being made in this particular context of recruiting, it's, you know, kind of going back to what we talked about with rest and recovery, like kids that are on their seventh game in a weekend, on their third weekend in a row away from home, when really they would just love to be at the house chilling, watching Netflix or just relaxing, or, hanging out with friends or whatever. And, or if we go into the context of your high school season and you start factoring in all of we talked last about the academic pressures that are going on in their lives because they've got to make a 34 on the ACT, or they've got to pass this class, or they didn't get accepted into this particular college, or the homecoming date said no to them, and all, everything that just sort of comes with life. And it's like, oh, well, if you stepped over the line and came into the gym today, you're supposed to just block all that out. And it's like, yeah, in an ideal world, sure, but we're human. You can't just leave all that behind. And so it really does speak to this just sort of overinflated sense of self in, I don't know if what the best word for this is, ego, hubris, whatever, in your ability as an evaluator to assess body language. What have we done as coaches to train ourselves in inspecting body language, where we can be, let's use our made up statistic for the fifth episode in a row, 90% of the time right. And a lot of coaches would
Hmm.
probably say, well, I've been doing this for 30 years. I know what bad body language looks like. And it's like, okay, but do you? You know what you
But
think it
why
has
does it
been for 30
matter?
years. But right.
Right. Not only do you, but why does it matter so much in the grand scheme of you watching that player? And again, we're just speaking mostly in the recruiting sense right now. But why does it matter so much in this one instance that you saw that player and they just, they did not meet your ever changing, goalpost moving standard for what good body language is? And I think part of it is coaches might say they'd rather a player be neutral than show negative body language. But what we're really telling those players then is you can't be human. You can't have a moment where, yes, you might be frustrated. Because I've also been on the other side of that where we look at players who are perpetually like saccharine and happy all the time. And those kids get a pass from maybe not being as good, but they're also not going to get recruited as highly if they also can't put the ball in the bucket like some other players can, right? So we use it as a way to write kids off. We use it as a way as like sort of the separator or the differentiator when all things are equal, skill wise or fit wise, who has the better body language. But realistically, we don't do it the other way where we say, hey, that kid has great body language and I'll take her or I'll take him before I take this other kid, even though that kid is less skilled. I very much believe, especially with the transfer portal, especially with COVID years, especially in high school athletics where you don't really have a choice because you got a coach who shows up unless you have, I mean, massive numbers coming out every year. You don't really have a choice about all those things. And you may, and this is maybe old advice that I got one time about not ruling yourself out of a win, like not having so many rules that you can't win. This might be one of those things where coaches who perhaps want to trust their eye test might be eye testing themselves out of a great opportunity to help somebody, which is what we should be here to do in the first place. Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, it's what we, why do you coach? So
Mm-hmm.
it's to help young people become better versions of themselves. Well, how does, just saying have better body language, or I'm going to punish you for having bad body language, how does that get them there? So the question that I always love to ask, and I think it's a great question to ask on any of these things, is okay, well, what are we doing to teach what your definition of good body language is? What is that? And coaches might say, well, we tell them, or we try to reinforce it, or it's all about habits and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like, we as a profession, the same coaches talk a lot about, well, we want to lead by example. And so we have no problem knocking, again, the 14, 15, 16-year-olds body language. But then if we were to ever film ourselves as coaches on the sidelines, we would never sign us based on the way we act on the sideline. And like you said, forget just actual language, what's coming out of our mouth, assuming that we don't say anything at all. What is our body language and our reaction to a bad call, or as you like to put it, the perception of a bad call doesn't even mean it's a bad call or a
Mm-hmm.
wrong one, but you perceive it to be that way. And we start stomping around or flinging our head. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, and this is just embarrassing to really say out loud, but how many times I flung my jacket off when I didn't like a call when I was a head coach. How many times I slapped the bench that I was sitting on. Like, I was that guy for years. And if
So Kim Mulkey must have gotten it from you then.
oh, 100%.
When
Well,
the jacket comes off and she's
I can
going
twirl around
buck
like
wild on the
crazy.
sidelines.
Yeah, she's trying to be like
Yeah.
me. And so we again, it's you need to have better body language, in a sense, saying don't ever have bad body language. But I don't put a plan in place to teach you how to do that, but yet also lead by example, but yet not my example, because my example is going to be terrible. And so where is the clarity and the alignment in the mind of the athlete to go, well, what am I supposed to do here? And I'm not supposed to be human, like you said. I need you to be a robot. I don't ever want you to show any sort of disappointment. But then when we get to the root of why they are showing that disappointment, it's because we coach through a lens of such judgment. And I would shout out the book Inner Game of Tennis or Inner Game of any of those sports. If you've read those or haven't read those, I would suggest it. In talking about trying to coach and evaluate and teach through not just bad judgment, but even good judgment. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
saying things like good shot, bad shot, or for whatever reason using like binary feedback and just saying yes and no all the time, like what they're supposed to be able to do with that, to be able to actually teach through that environment and stay away. Now, and that's an extremely difficult thing to do too, because I catch myself doing it all the time when I was teaching, especially the younger in the last grade that I taught, seventh grade. Like it's hard to be in a room full of seventh graders and not use judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Either from a good sense or a bad sense. But a lot of times that good judgment and praising them in some instances can end up being detrimental
Mm-hmm.
to the way the players are perceiving things or their own development, because the moment that that praise is taken away, they don't know how to handle that disappointment. And so that disappointment might manifest itself, this mental piece might manifest itself in a physical component, which we then perceive as bad body language. When, if we were to take a step back, the reason for that physical manifestation of the mental issue is because we are the ones projecting that on them. And that is a very complex sort of, map to kind of weave yourself through. But I think if you could, every coach that's listening to this right now can probably think of an instance in their last practice where something they did or said sort of triggered that chain of events and led to that. And then you can
Mm-hmm.
just sort of see this thing snowballing over and over and over and over and over again. And over the course of an entire practice, an entire week, a season, or a career, this is sort of how we end up with these things being such prevalent issues.
So I think it's interesting that you bring up how coaches have an effect on that, because I think like and I would ask coaches who are listening to this, just maybe rewind this or pause it here in a couple seconds after I say what I'm about to say, and just really think about this. What do we do as coaches authentically, right? Using the human component wheel. How do we recruit our players every day to help us understand what's going on in their life that can lead to their bad body language? Because most of the time, that kid is not necessarily reacting or having poor body language or unfocused, because I think that's part of it too, because of what's happening in basketball, right? And so when we really like break that down as coaches and as educators, kids are coming to us, and I say kids, this is the gamut of all athletes. They are coming to us from something else. Even though we place a significant amount of importance on everything that has to do with our sport, those athletes are coming from 95 other different things that they prioritize in their own way. And so it gets to the idea too that, like, we've heard coaches say this. I mean, I think Jay Wright said it, and not to name drop Jay Wright, but I think he said something similar of like, you can't expect them to care about this as much as you do as a coach. Well, sure, that's true, right? But in a manner of speaking, then their body language is them caring.
Mm-hmm.
Their body language is them saying, "Man, I was hoping for, or I expected more from myself in that moment, and I am disappointed in me." And when you ask players, instead of judging them, instead of standing at half court, having conversations with your assistants where you pick out all the flaws with every single player and you just judge them and judge them and judge them and judge them, asking those players, "Hey, how do you feel right now? Can I raise your awareness to something that I noticed, and I'm curious if you noticed it too?" That's a much more valuable conversation than, "Hey, you better fix your face or I'll fix it for you. Get on the line. I'm going to scream now because I paid my dues. I was neutral and I showed great body language my entire playing career, if you played. I have to hold my tongue, but now I don't have to because I'm the one with the whistle." Right? And again, like, it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but that is the story in gyms, on fields, on playing surfaces all over this country. And the higher level you go and the more eyes are on the program, whether those are live stream eyes, whether those are TV eyes, whether those are your SID's eyes, right? the more eyes that are on the program, the more pressure there is for the coach to feel as if they have to do or say something, and the athlete cannot have any sort of reaction to that, lest it be this major issue that manifests itself as we never should have recruited that kid or had that kid on the team in the first place. They are the problem. And we're just going to understand them as, you know, somebody who doesn't really want what's best for the team. And their body language precludes them from being able to play or being able to contribute positively to this team right now. Like that is the level to which coaches deify body language evaluations and inspections. And I think as a coach right now, it is probably one of the most damaging things we can do as far as it goes with our athletes' self-talk, with their positive internal voice, and how they narrate their own lives, because they are constantly having to figure out how to be this outward facing human being and put on a show so they can just survive the next practice, so they can just survive the next game, because all they want to do is play.
Well, your best player, Asim, is supposed to have your best body language.
Also
Your
supposed to
best
be the
player
hardest worker.
is supposed to be the hardest worker. If they're not the hardest worker and they don't have the best body language, meaning if they don't comply the most to your rules, then they can't possibly be your best player, right? We hear that stuff all the time, all over the place. And then it comes down to, okay, well, then what is best player? Is it skill? Is it talent? Is it total package? Is it leadership and character and all this? And again, like you can coach for 50 years and never coach a kid that's got all those things. That is top-notch kid, complies with all the rules, goes above and beyond, has great character, is a great teammate, is positive, and they're, uber talented. There's just how many of those exist? And when you come down in level, quote unquote level, where the parity starts to become even more skewed, talent stands out more, I would argue. So if I've got the one athlete in the gym, or I've got the one girl that can dribble, or I've got the one kid that nobody can tackle, they're going to play. And we'll sort of put up with a little bit of this or a little bit of that, or but I would argue that not only is your best player not your hardest worker, your best player is not your best body language. I would argue that probably one of your worst players is actually your hardest worker.
Mm-hmm.
And your worst player actually has the best body language. And by worst, I'm talking more from a skills standpoint. Because if they weren't the hardest worker and they didn't have the best body language, then they probably wouldn't be on your team to begin with.
Right, we
Especially if you
refer
have
to
a
those
choice.
kids as glue kids or culture kids and things like that. And it's like,
They're
wait a
role
minute.
players.
They're role players, and their role is to cheer on the kids that if the roles were reversed, that kid wouldn't have a role.
Correct.
Right. So if, and this is another one where, and we can talk about standards until we're blue in the face. I mean, we've sort of cornered the market on how that works. But if the standard is the standard for everybody, then shouldn't that kid that you just described be the one who plays the most because they uphold the standard bar none?
Better than anybody. They can't dribble, they can't pass, they can't hit a baseball, they can't do
Dang if
any
they
of the
don't
things that are
smile
going.
when they brick that layup.
But man, you struck out 8 times in a row. You jog back to the dugout and put your helmet back on there and you high five everybody. So like you get to keep playing. It's like no, and we're being a little tongue in cheek here, but I don't think we're being as tongue in cheek as the other side of the argument is either. Right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
if you're and every team, if there's 12 kids on a basketball team, if there's 20 kids on a baseball team, if there's 75 kids on a football team, you know, somebody's got to be number 75,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like somebody's got to be number 12 on the 12-man roster. You have to be. And really what coaches are wanting and saying that if you want to stand out or you want to make the roster and not be number 13, then you better have the best body language and the hardest working and the best attitude, and do go above and beyond. And maybe you show up to all those wink wink optional workouts all summer long, that you didn't have to be here, but they did. But your best player is probably most talented, is not a terrible person, and they've got not the best body language, but if they're the ones that can put the ball in the hoop, field, hit the ball, whatever, they're going to play. And we can all say that they're not, but there's a whole lot of those kids that play every
Mm-hmm.
single day in every sport across everything. And again, and I'm not saying that doesn't necessarily make anybody hypocritical, but I think it comes back to the standpoint of, okay, well, that maybe that player played for you for 4 years. Did their body language improve? And maybe it's not the best in the world, but were you able to help them improve them? And by improve them, I'm talking about raising their awareness and raising the other people around them to their awareness, to maybe where it's not just the adult in the room telling them, hey, fix your face, but their
Mm-hmm.
teammates start to take some of that ownership, and they start to kind of help them, quote unquote, fix their face, or they're able to do it on their own, which obviously would be ideal. But again, we every time we seem to go down this road, we always circle back to the fact that the adult in the room typically is the one with the worst body language, and that we expect our players and our kids and our students to be held to a much higher standard than we hold ourselves. But then again, we come back with, well, we need to lead by example. And so where I have a really hard time with the whole body language thing in particular is that, again, not saying that it doesn't matter, but I will not take that argument or that debate seriously until every coach and adult in the room has fixed it themselves.
And not just fixed it once, but I think fixed it permanently. I mean, I think like, you know, when it comes time for evaluations of coaches, like where's the rubric for coach behavior? Right? How often is somebody in the gym watching the coach and, you know, their body language is awful? What do we think our players, and this doesn't matter what the sport is. It doesn't matter what the sport is. It doesn't even matter what the activity is. Think about this in terms of the classroom. Think about this in terms of at home. If the person that you are supposed to look up to, or the person that you have, let's say it's your spouse, that you should have the utmost respect for, if that person showcases their disappointment in you, how is that supposed to make you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Now, think of yourself at 14 to 18 years old, or even 18 to 22 years old, and the power dynamic that's at play. And all of a sudden, that same person is showcasing the very thing they told you was unacceptable. The lack of alignment and the lack of congruence that exists between those two things, what we say to do and what we actually do, causes more trauma for student athletes than yelling, than getting put on the line, any of those things. Because you didn't do what you said you needed to do or what I should do, and you are not modeling those same things, that causes significant mental health issues in student athletes of any age. And to take that a step further, it becomes abusive. because I always then will feel, as that student athlete, as that person with whom there is a power dynamic, I will feel as if I am targeted and I cannot be myself. And I think we don't need to look any further than Brittany Griner's experience at Baylor, right? Brittany Griner, we need to bring her home at some point. Like it's past due. I think we can all agree about that. But let's think about her experience at Baylor, being 6'9", gay, very, I mean, very not somebody that you can easily hide when you're out in a group. She certainly sticks out when she was on Baylor's campus, Baylor being a very conservative place, Kim Mulkey being very conservative in terms of how she ran her program, being very open about the fact that, you know, she didn't support LGBTQIA plus rights. And she openly told Brittany Griner, hey, I don't care. You can be, and this is, you know, not the direct quote, but basically saying you can be purple, white, black, green. It doesn't matter. If you can hoop and you want to come here and do what you need to do, that's fine. Right. And she's essentially telling her to fake it until she makes it. So throughout that entire process, Brittany Griner had to be somebody that she wasn't just to fit in and get by. And she goes to the league. Her personality flourishes. She goes, plays over in Russia. It was always going to be this big star in basketball. But realistically, the mental toll that that took on her, she speaks openly about it in interviews. And you notice, like, there really is no connection between Brittany Griner and Baylor anymore. And so if she had shown, quote unquote, bad body language at Baylor, if she had shown any of those things, she would have been written off as a problem. She'd been written off as not worth it. Same thing that happens to Liz Cambage now. I mean, you see the narrative there, right? And she's done some very questionable things. I'm not defending any of Liz Cambage's actions, but she gets called out for the same type of thing, and she has severe mental health issues too. Right? She's dealing with a lot of things that we don't know about, but those manifest themselves as her complaining to the officials for calls, her calling out teammates in post-game press conference, her more or less trying to take care of herself out of self-preservation. Again, we don't know all the things that go on behind the scenes, but publicly, which is body language, right? We say as coaches this platitude of body language screams, it doesn't whisper. Well, her body language screams in a number of different ways, whereas Brittany Griner wasn't allowed to for her own self-preservation. So, in a manner of speaking, then, the athletes that are quote unquote showing bad body language, some of that might be self preservation. Some of that might be that they simply can't, control their emotions to the point where they can just be neutral about continually disappointing you as the coach. Because there is a power dynamic at play, and there are plenty of times where coaches have told kids, hey, there were 1,000 other kids that wanted to come here. Why should we keep you? I
I
mean,
think
if you heard that from your wife, that there were 1,000 other dudes that I could have married, but I happened to marry you, that probably wouldn't go over very well, would it?
right. Well, I think you're hitting on this theme of we as coaches constantly telling ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can say like, well, we're just going to write you off because of the bad body language, what we're saying in a lot of context, I would argue, is that I either don't care enough or am not skilled enough to help you work on that issue. So I'm just going to sort of opt out of this and go find someone else who will comply better than you will. And again, in certain instances, if you're Gino with his bad body language doesn't play video, yeah, he can afford to say that, right? He can afford to go find another All-American, or he's got 7 of them on the bench, and he can afford to sit, one All-American to play for another. And his situation is not your situation. I as a junior high football coach can't just go find 8 other, kids to play for me, and just expect that I'm going to replace what I lost. I've got to be better in what we're defining those things as, coming back to our standards, coming back to not, and when we say standards, I'm not talking about just picking 5 or 6 words and plastering them all over the locker room or a t-shirt or a poster or anything like that. Those are just adjectives. Those are just words. They're
Hmm.
descriptors. They're not standards at that point. Standards have to be defined, actualized, and we have to be able to measure those things and all that kind of stuff. And if we haven't done that yet, then how can we really punish somebody for saying that they're not living up to a standard that doesn't actually exist?
And to that point, so I'm glad you brought that up. And maybe this is another time where coaches, especially those that are recruiting, which hint hint is everybody, like even if you're not a college coach out evaluating talent, you're still recruiting your hallways, you're still recruiting your youth program. That's, foundational to what we do here at Essential Coaching. Like if you are really recruiting people, those are conversations you need to be having with those people so they know what the standard is in the program. It should not be ambiguous as to what we are actually looking for here. But that's not just defined by the coaches, that's defined by the players in the program, right? I do a lot of work when it comes to understanding equity and how we can create a better athletic experience through the lens of what players need, what teams need, what they never want to go through again, and what they want their allies to know. And when we do these types of things, when I do these sessions, especially with the athletes, what comes out from them is exactly what we're talking about. Stop inspecting every single thing that I do. I am doing my best. I want my allies to know that I do care about this, but I also have a million other things going on right now. And maybe it seems like I'm not paying attention, or it seems like I'm maybe out there today, or my body language is off today. That's a pretty good indication that you should come and ask me what's going on, because I'm not just going to volunteer that information to you. And maybe that's because I don't trust you. Maybe that's because we haven't developed the connection we should have yet, but I'm trying. What if we took that approach instead of immediately jumping to, oh, well, that kid's body language is terrible? You haven't even talked to that kid about what the standard is in your program that you're trying to recruit them to, right? Think about that as a recruiting conversation, as opposed to, hey, Kyle, we saw you play. You're so good. I really want to offer you a spot, this, that, and the other, right? The barrier of entry has to be higher if we're going to maintain the integrity of our athletic programs and actually put coaches to work being about the right things. And right now, we are not about the right things if all we're doing is looking at kids and saying, hey, I watched you for a half. I didn't like how you pouted when you missed that layup and you jogged back on defense instead of sprinting. And then that same coach walks into their gym and there's 13 kids on their team that do the exact same thing.
Right. And uh, again, I just keep coming back to this idea that we're telling on ourselves when we sort of say these things to, because we want to, I don't know, sort of keep up with the Joneses on Twitter. And we know the platitudes to say, and it's like we sort of lean on those things as crutches because they're easy to say, I think, and it's reactionary. It's almost like we can't really help ourselves sometimes. But I think if we're going to say things like body language doesn't whisper, it screams, are we at least taking the time to ask us what exactly is it screaming? And like you said, it might be them screaming for help. It might be them screaming for, I'm so disappointed in myself. I've let myself down. My mom, I'm going to get yelled at when I get in the car and go on the way home. I let you down because I care about you as my coach. I let my teammates down. It's screaming things that we can use as opportunities to learn from and make them better people and ourselves better people and all those types of things. But if we're going to at least say that, then let's at least reflect on what exactly we're screaming about. And again, I think I would rather have somebody with bad body language or work with somebody who has, this was me in the classroom. I would much rather have somebody that had a hard time kind of keeping in check in classroom than somebody who wanted to just come in and sleep and not do anything. Because at least if there's some screaming going on, at least if there is some pushback, there's at least some life right there. There's some emotion coming out, some energy being put into that relationship. Now, it might need to be misdirected. They might be using it in a misguided way, but at least there is some breath and some life there. I would much rather have that player or person in the room with me than somebody that's quote unquote lifeless or doesn't want to be there at all, and or just doesn't care, and there's just sort of a flat affect, and there's really like nothing we can do to kind of get them moving. Like, give me that first person, because I feel like we've got a much better chance at getting where we need to go if there's the energy to begin with, right? So we talked about rest and recovery and kind of gassing up the car. Like, I would rather there be kind of bad gas there, than none at all. And so if how many times did we as teachers hear, well, so and so is so bad in my class, so and so is so terrible, and they do this and they do that, and then they go into the next classroom and they're fine.
Mm-hmm.
So, if they have their bad body language that you're perceiving, but they're a high school player and they are in drama and they play sports and they play 3 or 4 sports and they do this and they do that, and they're taking in all these signals from all these different adults who are all doing it differently, you just start to think about how confusing and how overwhelming that might be, that you're catching them in a moment when they're with the person or with that in that particular environment that brings out some of those more negative, quote unquote, you know, body language aspects. Whereas if you caught them in a completely different situation, a day before, an hour before, a quarter or a possession before, you would have thought something completely different. And that's sort of that short-sightedness of judging somebody on that, that first impression, which may be the only one they get. I get that. Like, you might not have the opportunity to build a relationship with this person over the summer if you're recruiting them. But if they're in your high school and you're with them all the time, then I would hope that we've got the ability to do that. But there are schools are getting ready to go back into session. Fall camps for football and volleyball and those things are picking up. There are kids walking into schools right now as we speak who are being typecasted in the teacher's lounge as, a bad kid, somebody
Mm-hmm.
whose body language screams in their classroom, somebody that is, an eyesore on their roster. But that same exact kid goes right across the hallway into the next classroom and is not an issue. And so again, it comes back to we kids, especially because they don't have a whole lot of control over what they get to do. They're products of their environment. And so if we can tweak the environment and how we control that, then maybe we could not just say, hey, fix your body language. Maybe we've got the ability here as behavioral, sort of managers to tweak a lot of what that body language is just by simply changing the environment, changing the way we interact with them, changing the way we use good or bad judgment when we, evaluate or inspect their performance, the way that we talk to them. That a lot of that, again, coming back from good, better, and best, not saying that body language isn't important and we shouldn't talk about it and that bad body language is to be written off, but raising our awareness and going from good, better, and best and saying, okay, what impact do we have on that athlete's body language, and what are some things that we can do to not just help correct it, but maybe keep them from going down that path, and to begin with, and at the same time checking our own body language. and making sure that we're handling ourselves first. Because if we want to be the coach that, again, quote unquote, leads by example, they're watching us.